Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, but there's no actual coffee. Each episode, we interviewed an expert in the field of law enforcement analysis to share their career-defining stories and to get their insights on the world. Please join us on recognizing and learning from these brilliant minds as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
I hope many aspects of your life are progressing. My name is Jason Elder. Today, my guest is a former crime analyst, a former FBI analyst, a crime consultant, an instructor, volunteers with End Violence Against Women International nonprofit organization. She's worked almost a decade in LexisNexis as a fraud analyst manager and a public safety platform manager. She's a music enthusiast. She's an editor. She's cringing because I'm introducing her with a run-on sentence. I am fortunate today to welcome Samantha Gwinn. Sam, how we doing?
Hi, Jason. How are you?
I am doing well. Before we get started, how is home life under the COVID quarantine?
Well, it's, probably not as much of a shift for me as it is for a lot of people. I live alone and work from home all the time. So that part is pretty much the same. The biggest change is just the lack of travel, lack of fun times with friends and family and that kind of stuff. So it's tough, but I'm managing, and I think it's important that everybody helps each other out by staying home. So that's what I'm doing.
Totally agree. And you and I are both well ahead of the curve by working at home. So
yeah, right. Yeah, I am definitely moving more slowly and doing things I wouldn't normally do. Like I actually had a thought yesterday that I might make banana bread, which a thought has never entered my mind ever. So, but maybe it'll happen.
Yeah, my wife made banana bread actually about 3 weeks ago, and it has chocolate chips and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's basically cake. I don't know where the bread person comes into play with that, but it's basically cake. Yeah,
it's breakfast cake. That's exactly what it is.
There you go. So, I want to start with your work with LexisNexis. In terms of law enforcement analysis, there's not a lot of well-known companies that throughout the industry, but LexisNexis has a great influence over the profession. I guess I wanted to get your perspective on working for LexisNexis and its incredible influence over law enforcement analysis.
Sure. So, I came to work for LexisNexis specifically for a reason. I thought about leaving government, and that was a tough decision, but what I really wanted to do was contribute to the profession and to crime analysis and to investigations in a more comprehensive way and be able to contribute in a way that would affect a lot of people. So, the way to do that, obviously knowing as an analyst all the tools that I would use and that we all use to do our jobs, and the things that there's some that are really good and some that are not so great. And the idea of being able to work towards offering up better things for agencies to use became appealing to me as I thought about leaving government. And of course with LexisNexis, it's, such a well-known, well-established organization. And there was something that they were working on at the time before I started working for them, that I just thought was, unique and innovative. And, I thought, that was one of the things that kind of sparked that thought. So that's why I came here. I think that one of the benefits of it is the people that work here. We have a lot of former law enforcement and a lot of people who just generally appreciate and understand the way that law enforcement works and are wanting to help out with that, all the way up to our CEO is just really pro law enforcement. I don't mean that in like a generic way. I mean just anything we can do to help, we try to do. So I like that aspect of it. Of course, just having all the data to play with is fun, and being able to learn new things all the time is definitely a plus.
So was it a big transition for you coming from the public sector into the private sector?
Yeah, when I was in my last job in the government was with the FBI and the VICAP unit, which is a Violent Criminal Apprehension Program unit, which is a super cool job and was my dream job and everything. And I was there for about 5 years. And leaving was a tough decision, but the transition mainly was, obviously I went from working and commuting every day to an office, to working from home, which was a big transition and a huge plus in my book, at the time. So that was nice, but just the general atmosphere is different from government to private sector. I think especially when you're in a bureaucracy, such as a federal agency, and moving to a corporation that we're a relatively small part. Our group is a relatively small part of a very large corporation, so it felt a little more personal, and like there wasn't so much standing in your way. If you had an idea and you wanted to see it come to fruition, it seemed like there was more of a chance of that in the private sector, and that was my main draw to leaving government. But I mean, I was definitely pretty sad to leave my colleagues at the Bureau and to stop calling myself a crime analyst. That was really hard. And, I mean, that's my thing. And I still consider that to be my profession, because that's still great. Something that, I mean, I wouldn't put it on my business card, but that is my field.
It's interesting that you moved to a corporation to feel more closely knit to a family that you work with.
Yeah, so, it is weird.
leave it to the FBI to make you feel that way, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say too much, but it's
not trying to get you into trouble.
Yeah, and you know me pretty well. We've known each other for a long, long time, and I'm not much of a I'm not very bureaucratically minded, so that was tough for me to. There was a lot of, but why can't we? When I was there. So much to the chagrin of my supervisors, I'm sure.
So what kind of projects are you working on now as a public safety platform manager?
Well, right now I work with our product development team, and I'm not a technical product manager or an engineer or anything like that. I just try to help steer the direction of what we're building. So I kind of bring that end user perspective directly to the team that's developing the products that we're putting out into the market. So mostly that consists of our Accurate Virtual Crime Center, but it also just anything generally in the field world of public safety, whether it's federal or state and local level. I try to be involved in those conversations. So that's definitely, it allows me to kind of straddle several different parts of the organization to contribute to that effort.
As you were talking, I was just envisioning just the amount of data that LexisNexis must have at their disposal. It's probably impossible to get your head around.
Yeah. Well, and it's fun to dig into, because then you get into the whole, I mean, again, with the whys, it's always, we would use, like when I was working a lot with fraud, we'd have a certain fraud indicator that is supposed to tell you if, let's say it's supposed to tell you if this identity is a fake identity or whatever. Mm-hmm. So it would be like, okay, well, where did that come from? Or where did that data come from? Oh, well, it comes from blah, blah, blah. Well, where does that data come from? And and just that digging in is, and I think part of that was coming from that crime analyst background of getting to the bottom of what does this really mean, and is it important, and should we be using it? Is I think it's fun for me. Mm-hmm. I'm always learning something new about our data.
So speaking of fraud, I think some people, when they hear fraud investigation, they picture analysts searching through a room full of boxed paper. I mean, I'm sure that's both correct and incorrect, right?
Yeah, there are some fraud analysts or fraud investigators that do that for sure. I know a good buddy of mine, and I think of yours too, works for the HHS as a fraud investigator. So the Federal Health and Human Services. So they're always looking at medical fraud and Medicare fraud and healthcare fraud and, medical supplies and all that stuff. And yeah, they do go in and go through boxes of paperwork for sure. But fraud analysts, as far as it mixes in with the crime analysis world, I think is more just looking for anomalies and looking for patterns in the data. So you're looking for things like, has this address been used in multiple different claims, or, is this certain doctor prescribing more painkillers than another doctor or whatever it is. It's just looking for patterns and trends and then trying to isolate that and figure out what the actual issue is. And then of course doing some more reasoning in the other direction to see if it's a larger problem. So that's really what it is. It's just analyzing different data instead of, vehicle burglaries and robberies. You're looking at transactions essentially.
Always about the data.
Yeah.
So, and
it's even less of a personal aspect when you're looking at fraud. I think like with crime or, everyday street crime, whatever you want to call it, it's a very personal thing. There are victims that you see their names and you see their faces sometimes and you see the impact of crime on communities. And with fraud and other types of even any kind of white collar crime, if you will, it's much more abstract, I think, and it is even more data focused because you don't have that luxury of the big picture. You're just finding that bits of information. And of course, there are victims when it comes to identity fraud. And obviously, it has a real effect on people's lives. But a lot of times as an analyst, you're not seeing that far down into it. You're just looking at data at that point.
And you're allowed to be a name dropper on this show. Who works for HHS?
Oh, Greg Jones.
Oh, Greg Jones. Okay, I got you.
Yeah.
Good.
And he'll love that I just mentioned his name too. So
very good. All right, so I want to segue into the next segment. It's storytelling time. You had mentioned that you still feel like you're an analyst. Can you tell me a story or a time that you really felt that you earned your analyst badge?
Sure. So for a lot of my earlier crime analysis career, I worked for the San Diego Police Department, and I was really lucky to get an initial position there as a paid intern after an unpaid internship with Las Vegas Metro PD, where I worked in the basement with Dan Helms and Kurt Zimmer and a few other folks that stayed in the industry for a while. So I had a 5-week unpaid internship in Vegas and then went to a paid internship in San Diego. And through both of those internships, really, I just learned the fundamentals. But the things that really stuck out to me was working with investigations and working with sex crimes. And I remember even in Las Vegas, Kurt Zimmer handing me a piece of paper with a printed out spreadsheet on it of a number of different sexual assaults that had occurred throughout the city over the last, I think, year it was. I don't remember the exact parameters of it, but I just remember getting a giant list of all of the different elements of each crime, including, the time of day of week, the locations, any other aspects of the crime that were interesting. And he said, see if you can find any similarities. And that was my first foray into that world. And I just thought, and this is a time when all of us that went into that crime analysis world, I shouldn't say all of us, but a lot of us and a lot of folks that I know, we all wanted to be profilers, right? We all were reading John Douglas, Mindhunter. We all thought we were going to go into the FBI and be profilers. And so that was kind of the state of mind of getting this list of information and seeing, let me try to figure this out. Then it occurred to me that I could potentially do something similar to all this cool stuff I had been reading about, but without being, out in the field and without actually being in dangerous situations or anything like that. You could actually just help investigators and help police do their jobs and help them, catch these bad guys. So that was kind of my initial introduction to it. And then when I got to San Diego PD as an intern, I was there for a little while. I left and worked for the school district police department for, I think, 2.5 years I was there, and then went back to San Diego PD as a full-time analyst. And once I got back, I was assigned as the sex crimes analyst. So I had 2 area commands working on, your typical area command tactical analysis, some more intelligence-led type of analysis back in the day. And then I was also doing this investigative work. While working with the sex crimes unit, we had an active serial rape investigation that was ongoing at the time when I was there. So what I mean by that is that we had adult male we didn't know who he was, and he was breaking into women's homes and attacking them most of the time in late night, early morning hours, mostly in certain little pockets of the city. And we had very, very little information to go off of, but it was like a TV show sometimes where we had another one. We think we had another one last night. And so working with the detectives hand in hand on that, I got to learn a lot about how they do their job and what they're focused on. And then of course, leaning into the world of DNA and the lab and what they could do. And I mean, this is back in, I'm trying to think of what year it was, probably 2003, somewhere around there. So DNA was a thing for sure, but not nearly to the extent that it is now. But, I was back and forth on the phone constantly with the detectives, but also with our local lab, looking at different people that they had profiles on and seeing if we could compare those profiles to any evidence that we got from the scene, and just constantly working with the lab to see what more we could do to try to identify this person who we had DNA on and nothing else. So as this is happening, suddenly we get notification that there was an additional case, but it was now in Tucson, Arizona. So now we have an interstate ongoing serial sexual assault investigation that's happening. From there, of course, everything kind of shifted, right? Because you're not just looking at this local perspective. Now you're looking at an entirely different potential population for your suspect. And maybe he lives in Tucson. He doesn't even live here. Maybe he's back and forth. Maybe he did live here and now he moved. And so it was constant communication because we had additional cases after that in Tucson and then also in San Diego. So mostly they seemed to shift to Tucson, but then there still was some, I think there was maybe one more case in San Diego during that time. So they had a crime analyst at the time in Tucson named Roxanne. Roxanne, I never know whether it's Stead or Stead, but she and I were almost daily on the phone running people back and forth constantly. Like, hey, have you, somebody that would come up as interesting during my searches, hey, do you have any contacts for this guy? And she and I are back and forth and photo lineups for the victims and just ongoing communication, and then still, waiting to see what we could do with this DNA. During this time, we also ended up getting a hit from a case in Sparks, Nevada from years ago that was another unsolved case. So then we're looking at, okay, do we have anybody in the area that has ties to Nevada as well? And again, just expanding it out, doing what we could. So what ended up happening with this case is that there was another additional DNA linkage that came back to Norman, Oklahoma, of all places. So Norman, Oklahoma had a sexual assault, and I believe it was classified as an attempt murder on a adolescent girl. And all of our victims were mostly college age, young adults, and then I want to say into their 30s, I can't remember, but adults. I think the youngest was younger college age women. So this was a much younger victim. And it was from several years prior to our series. And they had DNA, but they just hadn't uploaded it into CODIS. So they hadn't uploaded their DNA into the national database that would have linked it to our cases. They apparently, I'm not sure, got the technology or got funding or something, and they uploaded their DNA. We got a CODIS hit on this case. So of course the detective that I was working with reaches out to Oklahoma, to Norman, Oklahoma, and they say, yeah, we got the hit, but we know this person's name. So they had a named suspect.
Oh, wow.
In this case, but they didn't know where he was. Then it became, okay, now he's ID'd. So now we have a name, which was James Allen Selby. That was the name of the offender. At that point, it became not only, we have to keep him from doing this again, but where is he? And how can we track him down and how do we catch him? From there, it turned into, we put together bulletins with person's face. And he was a very textbook, if you will, offender in that he had that chameleon capacity where his appearance changed over time, and he would do it on purpose. So if I remember very clearly a bulletin that we had put together that had pictures of him from over the years, and it wasn't hugely drastic changes, but blonde hair to brown hair, long hair, short hair, facial hair, no facial hair. A lot of different just changes in his appearance that were kind of intended, intentional, I think, to keep people off of his tail. So we learned more about him. We learned that he had been in the military. He had been in the Gulf War in the Army, I want to say. He also was getting VA benefits. So we essentially tracked down everywhere that he had ever picked up his VA benefits, and we printed out these bulletins with his face on it, sent the bulletins to all of the offices to which he had been, and then other ones in those areas, one of which was in Colorado, and said, if this person walks into your office to get his benefits, you need to basically call. Here's the number to call. Here's what you do, et cetera. And it worked. He walked into a Colorado VA office, and they stalled, and said, we need you to wait a minute, et cetera, called in the authorities, and he was arrested. I get choked up even thinking about it because it was such a moment that we did it, that we were able to to catch him. And these were all living victims. So these weren't homicides, so these victims were all able to see this person caught and brought to justice. Unfortunately, with him, he went into pretrial detention. He was scheduled to go to trial and ended up committing suicide in his jail cell before he was actually held accountable. But even during the time he was in jail, he had the whole, narcissistic personality where he was claiming responsibility for other cases that he had nothing to do with, things like that. So it was interesting in so many ways for me as an analyst, and I feel like I got to see every possible aspect of a successful and ongoing sexual assault investigation, that it helped me to get that perspective that a lot of people don't have. And it's probably a good thing to not have it in some ways, because we don't want these things to happen to people. But that case carries lessons. I carry lessons from that case with me to this day, and still am trying to help agencies and other crime analysts to understand that it's how important it is to have better, more open communication with your lab, and to work with your detectives as essentially as investigative support, versus just here's a map of all the sex crimes. Like, okay, great, but what else? What else can you do? And digging into the investigative side of things, I think, is important. And now that we have moved into the era of finding out all of these serial offenders that we didn't know existed through testing rape kit backlogs, which is an unfortunate and massive problem in our country, that we have all of these sexual assault kits. And for those who are not familiar, this means when a woman, usually woman, but also men, can go through the rape kit exam process. But usually if you are a victim of a sex crime or a sexual assault and you report that crime, you go to a hospital and you have an exam done that takes, in some circumstances, hours. Usually it takes hours to do. It's extremely invasive, can also be traumatic in its own way. But the entire purpose of it is to gather evidence in order to hold the offender accountable, and to just, ensure that investigation moves forward. And sometimes people do get the kits done and they don't prosecute, or they don't want to follow through. They don't want to, lose contact with investigators or whatever. And sometimes they move forward without the kit, whatever. But the whole point is, for many decades now, what has happened with a lot of those kits is they end up on a shelf and nothing ever happens. And thankfully, with a number of different grants over the past several years, mostly from BJA, and Dr. Angela Williamson is the one who's really been putting a lot of this out there and putting these programs out into law enforcement, we've seen that problem really be addressed in a huge way and with great success, that we've been able to bring a number of offenders to justice. But the crime analysis piece that I want to emphasize is that we are finding out so much more about serial sex offenders than we ever knew. There are cases being linked together because these kits are being tested that we would not ever have linked. We wouldn't have connected at all. We're learning so much more about serial offenders to the point that a lot of the conventional wisdom is thrown out the window, and it's changing the way that we look at sex crimes and sex offenders in general. So that, to me, is fascinating. And now even more than ever, it's important to understand DNA as a crime analyst and how you could potentially contribute to your agency being able to advance justice for victims of sexual assault.
You had mentioned this idea of the rape kit backlog and just sitting on the shelf. So you described the process of the victim going through the data collection or the evidence collection process. But I guess, why is the evidence sitting on the shelf? Is the processing expensive, or does it take a long time? Why is evidence just sitting on the shelf and backlogged?
Yeah, it's a good question, and an important question that I think we need to ask and have been asking of ourselves in law enforcement for the past few years. But the expense is one part of it, yes. But I think there has been a problem with the culture and with not prioritizing these cases in some circumstances. Also with not understanding how victims respond to trauma has been a huge problem, and it will lead in some cases to disbelief on the part of the first responder to that sexual assault, to whether it's a law enforcement agency or a victim advocate or whatever it is. People respond to trauma differently and not necessarily as you would expect. And I think the lack of understanding there up until really recently with a lot of the work of Dr. Rebecca Campbell out of Michigan and some others, Kim Lonsway from and Violence Against Women International, some other really great researchers and people in the field that have been making the point that people don't respond to trauma in the way that they're always going to be hysterically crying and, their lives are going to be broken from now on and they're never going to want to see that offender again and all these things that you would think would happen when you're traumatized. Those things can happen, but that's not necessarily how everyone responds. On top of that, there's the idea of being able to tell law enforcement what happened to you. For some victims of assault, the way your brain works, you can't piece that information together in a linear way, especially right after it happened. So many law enforcement investigations were centered and had been centered for a long time on ensuring that the victim was telling the truth. And you can even look in older manuals that thankfully are not used very much anymore, but old techniques in interviewing, they would actually focus in the actual books more on whether or not the victim was lying, how to tell if the victim was lying, and then on how to tell if the offender is responsible. So it had more material on the victim than it did on interviewing sexual assault offenders. And that right there, I think, is very telling as to how a lot of these cases were treated. And so it's not universal. A lot of people just didn't know. We didn't know how to respond. And as a result of that, you had a lot of victims who weren't necessarily believed, or maybe they felt that way. They felt that they weren't and decided not to engage any further with law enforcement. You see a lot of, I remember even back in San Diego, seeing a lot of cases in which it was, victim declined contact or victim declined prosecution or victim didn't return phone calls. And then you find out later that case is linked to additional cases. That lesson stayed with me, and I still talk about that in almost every presentation that I give, which is looking back on old data and seeing there are all these cases in which even named offenders, like this same guy has been named in 4 different sexual assault cases during which there was no follow-up just because individually those cases weren't taken seriously, or victim was maybe a drug addict or prostitute or whatever, and they just nothing happened with it. That offender was able to go on and victimize more people that were more marginalized, people that aren't likely to be believed or taken seriously or whatever. It's a real pattern that you see throughout this data, even back then, but now even more so now that the kits are being tested. I think that the lesson that's been learned by the work that's been done is that a lot of those assumptions and a lot of that conventional wisdom was wrong. It was just wrong. There's no room for opinion at this point. It's wrong, and it caused untold amounts of emotional and societal damage that we hopefully now can repair ourselves. I know there's a lot of states now, not all of them, but a lot of them, states and major cities that have laws passed that kits have to be tested within a certain amount of time. And, victim advocates have to be involved when interviewing victims and things like that are intended to not perpetuate this longstanding problem.
Talk a little bit more about that victim advocates, because that's what I was thinking about when you were just describing, whether to believe the victim. Because on the one hand, you have investigators who are in charge of the case, are there to have gone through training to interview victims and to try to start gathering evidence. But on the other hand, you have maybe an advocate that's coming in maybe more of a counseling role, and somebody that maybe the victim will trust, but then you get into counseling and you get into patient-client confidentiality, and it seems like an already difficult situation can be made worse.
It can be, but I think as long as there is a shared goal, the shared goal is making sure that the victim is able to tell their story, and that also an investigator or detective is on a mission to figure out what happened. And that doesn't change whether or not, with the work that that I do and that the organization does with End Violence Against Women, which I'll call EVA from this point on because it's just easier to say. That work is they have a campaign called Start by Believing, and there's a lot of misconceptions that are almost along the lines of what you're saying. Whereas if you ultimately say, I'm going to believe the victim from the get-go no matter what, then that somehow tarnishes the investigation or biases the investigation. But that's not the case at all. Like if you're, you wouldn't go into if somebody gets robbed in the street or their house gets broken into, you don't sit there wondering like, did it though? I mean, are you sure that that's what happened? That's not the way that you treat someone who's been a victim of such a trauma as sexual assault. It matters a lot to the point that there's been studies that have shown that getting a negative response to reporting a sexual assault is actually more detrimental than not reporting it at all. It's actually more traumatizing than if you just never told anyone. That aspect of it as well is why, having an advocate involved is important. And the shared goal, as I was mentioning, is you want the victim has to be in a certain state of mind to be able to explain what happened, and has to feel safe in order to explain what happened. If you're in a room, in an interrogation room with bright lights and a male detective, oftentimes that is not how you feel. You do not feel safe. You do not feel like you can say what happened, especially when you can tell that person doesn't understand or doesn't believe you. And with having an advocate present, not only present, but present during kind of as a partner for a sex crimes unit, just it really actually furthers justice and allows more offenders to be held accountable for the things that they have done once. And when I say held accountable, I mean arrested and convicted. I think that's the biggest misconception when they talk about Start by Believing, that somehow you're going to go, oh, you were assaulted. Well, I'm going to go arrest that guy right now. Like, that's not what happens. Mm-hmm. What happens is there's still fact finding and there is still an investigation. But if you don't believe at the outset and you don't give the victim the opportunity to explain what happened, then you don't have any information to start with. To begin, you don't have anything. You can't conduct an investigation. And yeah, that investigation might end with nothing happened here or whatever it is. And there, false reports do exist. That is a thing that happens, but it's much more rare than most people might think. And it's also having an advocate present will definitely keep the victim comfortable to the point that they are able to help the detective with doing an adequate investigation.
Is most police departments now on the same system like CODIS to be able to share DNA, or is that still an ongoing issue in the United States?
It's not as much of an issue. There are a lot of intricacies involved. The CODIS is, of course, the national system that is maintained by the FBI. There are no details on identity at all in the CODIS system. It's completely, anonymous is a strong word, but I can't call the FBI and say, hey, is this person's DNA in CODIS if I have their information? That doesn't work. Even when I worked at the FBI, I could not get that information. There are tens of millions of profiles in CODIS of unsolved cases and of known offenders, as well as, of course, missing and unidentified persons. But there are also labs at the state level and the local level. There are profiles, DNA profiles, that are held at the local or state levels that never make it to CODIS, but not necessarily because the state's not contributing, but because of their different laws. And then, of course, of the FBI's different standards as far as what can go into CODIS. So for example, some crime scenes, you can develop a DNA profile, but it's just a partial profile, meaning it doesn't have all of the markers present to be a full match on anyone. So you have to have a certain minimum number of markers there to go into CODIS. If it's just a partial profile, a lot of times that profile is maintained at the local or state level. And in order to compare it to a known offender or to another crime scene's DNA, that's more of a manual process. And actually, someone in the lab actually has to compare those two profiles at the request of a law enforcement agency. It's not just that there's a case that it happens, the DNA gets taken, and it automatically ends up in CODIS. There's several considerations to be taken there. There are a lot more profiles at the state level than there are at the federal level. And then there's the other benefit of at the state level, you can call a state lab and say, here's this person's state ID number, meaning an ID number assigned to them when they are arrested or convicted. It's essentially part of their rap sheet, if you will, that you have a state ID number if you have any sort of criminal record, here's a state ID number. Do you have this state ID number on file? Do you have a full profile for this person? So you can call the state CODIS administrator and ask them that. And they can tell you, has that profile been uploaded into CODIS? Again, it's more often than not, yes, and if you have somebody who's arrested for a rape or whatever it is, and they are found to be guilty through DNA, most likely, that DNA goes up the chain and it ends up in CODIS. But a lot of times it doesn't. I don't know of any states off the top of my head that are intentionally withholding information from CODIS because they don't have the technology. I don't think that we have that problem anymore. I don't think that's an issue as far as I'm aware, but there are, a number of other different intricacies there. And even discussing the backlog that we talked about, there is certain states have a statute that in order to upload DNA into CODIS, there has to be a crime needs to have occurred. And that's a tricky language to use because essentially a lot of the cases that happened over the years and are still happening to an extent now are being classified as unfounded. That's a disposition that's often assigned to cases where the victim doesn't follow up or the prosecutor doesn't want to follow up or whatever it is. Or maybe, it's a quote unquote he said, she said that nothing ever goes anywhere with it. It'll be listed as an unfounded case or it'll be listed as closed by exception. It can be listed as a report only. I've seen that as well as it's just a miscellaneous report. And in those situations, a lot of times the DNA, because of that disposition that's on the case file, the state won't upload that DNA to CODIS because a crime has not occurred and I'm air quoting as I'm saying this. So we know from looking at it that most likely, a crime probably occurred, but if there's no way to prove it, or there's no way, or the language doesn't change, or the laws don't change, then that DNA sits at the state level and never makes it up to CODIS. So we are seeing that for sure. And a lot of the hits that are coming back on the kits that are being processed, whether it's to another unsolved case or to an offender, a lot of those hits are actually happening at the state level, even more so than at the federal level because of that exact issue.
So what happens to the rape kit? I guess it just sits on the shelf, right? If it's in that situation where it's never going to be considered a crime by either the prosecutor or the investigator, and so it's never going to make it to CODIS, does it just sit on the shelf somewhere? Yeah.
So the best way you can really understand it is HBO did a documentary called I Am Evidence. And it covers in detail the discovery of this. There are a lot of people that worked in this field that knew it was a problem, but about 11, I think it was 10 years ago over this past summer that the anniversary, so to speak, of the discovery of over 11,000 kits in an abandoned warehouse in Wayne County, Michigan. And the DA, Kim Worthy in Michigan, was the one that spearheaded this effort and found there were already a number of untested kits that were there at, I believe it was, I might be misspeaking, but I think it was at their headquarters or at the main lab or whatever. There was a detective that had been working with the DA and made her aware of the presence of these kits. For whatever reason, it must have been part of an ongoing investigation. Somehow she was able to find out that there were more. In this documentary, you can actually see the video and the photos of this warehouse that just housed all of these kits. So this is, over 11,000. And when I'm saying kids, I'm saying victims, right? These are victims of crimes that nothing ever happened with them. So a lot of times, yes, that's what happens is they sit on a shelf and no one does anything with them. Sometimes some kits have been destroyed, which breaks my heart on so many levels because maybe the statute expires. They're not required to keep them. Whatever the law is that says whether you can have to keep them or whether you have to discard them or can discard them or whatever. Sometimes it was just arbitrary. Whoever the lab manager is, it's a lot of times it's up to them on how they handle those kits. So, but a lot of times it was just a matter of prioritization, funding, and we don't have the money to process it, or the lab doesn't have the capacity to process them, and then it just builds and builds. But there have been, you'll even have instances where agencies will go, oh no, we're good, we're up to date, we don't have any untested kits, we don't have a backlog, and then upon further investigation, oh, actually we do, we have 1,500 that are sitting there that. No, it's just never been anyone's problem to take on. No one has taken on the problem. And now that people are, there's more action being taken on it. And again, I don't want it to sound like this happens with every case or every detective is just like, oh yeah, right, whatever, and throws the kid on the shelf. There's a lot of good work that's being done and has been done over the years. It's a systemic issue that we've been working really hard for the last several years to address on a wide scale.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to lighten up, and we're going to talk a little bit about IACA, and we're going to make up the Sam Gwinn Music Festival. You're listening to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Carolyn Cassidy, and I'd like to give some information to you. We've all watched shows on TV where someone comes home and there's been a break-in. Their house is disrupted and possibly items have been stolen. Someone gets on the phone and calls 911. Help, please come. I've been robbed. Okay, let's clarify this. You have not been robbed. You have been burgled. A robbery is a person-to-person crime. A burglary is a property crime. If you are not home when someone comes in and takes something from you, you have been burgled. There has not been a robbery.
Hey, this is Sean Bear, and I would like to suggest that everybody go learn programming. I think that's the one thing that has carried me through all the different aspects of my life. And if you learn some programming, you'll better understand the application that you use, and who knows, you might even be able to write your own application. Good luck.
Welcome back. This is Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We're talking to Sam Gwinn. Before the break, you were sharing your badge story. Got a little heavy, and it was very good. But I want to lighten it up there to end this program. I want to talk a little bit about your work with the IACA, the International Association of Crime Analysts. We met, going to the conferences and doing volunteer work with IACA. And it's interesting. I think of certain people in the association, and whether it's Kyle Stoker in training or Rachel Carson's work with International Outreach Committee. And, when I think of you, you're IACA's editor. And
okay, I'll take that.
It's just done so many work with publications and so much with the textbooks. And I know you and I worked together when I was part of Standards, Methods, and Technologies writing white papers. And I want to take this opportunity to publicly apologize to you because I know I'm not a very good writer, and you had to clean up my messes plenty of times. So I guess both sorry and thank you. But I just feel that if it was my way, you would always be IACA's editor. And I know some people might drop Julie Wartell in there as well, and she would certainly qualify for the same distinction. Talk a little bit about your work with the IACA as editor, and even you were treasurer.
Okay. So first of all, I accept your apology, and it only took a couple years of therapy to work through it, but I'm doing okay now. No, so I started working with ICA as a younger analyst back in San Diego. I, of course, wanted to get involved, and I was really excited about being a crime analyst and going to the conferences and learning and showing up to all the classes and all that good stuff. Wanted to be involved, and I've always had a bit of a volunteer streak. They were looking for members to work on a certification committee, and so I got involved with that pretty early on. It's funny to think back now on that because a lot of the folks that were on that committee with me, I'm still really good friends with. And that's how we met was on this committee. Sally Rawlings, for example, who's out in Colorado. Sally and I met when she was pregnant with her daughter, Abby, who's now like 16 or something. I don't know.
She's driving.
Crazy. Yeah, she's driving a car. And there's been, others too as well. So I started working with that, and then also found myself as a board member, as a treasurer. Didn't really have any experience with that as much as, just general understanding about what the duties were. And then I worked with Kim Hathaway out of Washington State to make that transition and just learn what to do. But I mean, this is back in the day, right? So this is quick. I think QuickBooks maybe we were using some outdated version of QuickBooks, and that was a whole thing. Yeah, I mean, we were writing checks. There was a lot of non-electronic things going on. It was fine. It was, I think, really good experience for me. And my favorite part of it was working on the conferences. So I got to, of course, be involved in the financial aspect of the conferences and making sure that we didn't lose money and making sure that the contracts with the hotels were all taken care of and doing all that. And that was fun, but also just helping to scout the locations and plan it out. It's fun to plan a big event like that and have it go off well and hear people say that it was helpful to them and valuable to them and that they had fun like that. I really enjoyed that aspect of being on the board for sure.
Do you have any grammar pet peeves? And if you don't, if you can't think of anything off the top of your head, I actually have a couple of my own. I never correct anybody's grammar. One of them that just gets an instant reaction internally when somebody uses it is when someone says different than versus different from.
That's a pretty
yes, because I have
pet peeve.
Yes, my English teacher in 11th grade, Mr. Stahler from Wellsboro High School in Pennsylvania, he would always say different from, and that is stuck with me. 25 years later, when people do that, like it just one of those, I'm mostly proud because I actually recognize it, because most of the time I don't even recognize it. It just goes over my head, even whether it's right or wrong. I'm just usually trying to make sure I understand what people are talking about. I think the other one too is more of a pronunciation. I say salmon and most people say salmon. And so I always tell them, why you got to disrespect the L?
I'm hanging up.
Yeah, like why you got to disrespect the L? Salmon, there's an L there.
Salmon? How did I never know this about you? We've been friends for like 15 years. I didn't know this. Oh my God.
Yeah. Of course, then everybody sends me words with silent L's in them. But I mean, I usually tell people jokingly, it's like, why you got to disrespect the L? Salmon. So
well, now I'm going to say it like that from now on, just as a nod to you. I'll say salmon in every restaurant I go to forever. So let's get the side eye from the server.
I'm giving you a chance to think about your grammar pet peeves.
Oh gosh, I don't need a prompting. I've got a lot of them. I think I could say one that's more appropriate to modern days is texting. When I will do voice to text or do any sort of usually it's the voice to text, which it saves a lot of time, but they want to randomly capitalize things all the time in the text message before it goes out. And that drives me crazy. And I have to go back and fix it. I cannot send a text message with unnecessary capitalization, and that I think is a big pet peeve for me as well. Like whenever somebody sends me something to edit, that is one of the biggest things. I go through the whole document and I correct all the unnecessary capitalization. It's just, I don't know why. Like if you say I want to speak to the manager, that's a lowercase m, man. You don't need that's not how it works. So that drives me nuts for sure. That's a big one.
I am sure that I had plenty of those in my white papers. So again, I'm sorry.
A lot of people do. I used to be really funny about grammar, and that I would just correcting people's grammar in general. Like even, you see all these people doing it on in like internet comments and stuff. And it's just, I don't do that. I don't really I don't know. I don't let that bother me. And I also think, a lot of people weren't fortunate enough to have a certain level of education sometimes, or maybe English is their second language or whatever it is. I just think it's a kinder way to operate. To just doesn't matter. People are making mistakes here and there. They're getting their point across. Even people I disagree with, if they misspell something, I'm not going to be like, oh, you should take a spelling lesson. Like, I'm not doing that. So I'm trying not to be that guy. But like, if it's a professional thing or your resume or whatever, you have got to get somebody. For anyone out there who's an aspiring analyst or who's trying to get a job, you have got to get somebody to look at your resume. I can't tell you how many times I have gotten people applying for positions that I've been hiring for, and then also people that have just sent, hey, can you help me out? And it's like, oh my goodness. Like if I got this as a hiring manager, I would probably not consider you, because I can see that you don't have attention to detail. Like the fact that this is rife with, punctuation errors and whatever. And it's not even in a nitpicky way. I'm not going to get worried about like, oh, there's a period after some of your bullet points and not others. Like that's, yeah, okay, whatever. You probably should have fixed that, but you did. It's fine. It's fine. But like, there's a lot of other things in there that it's just like, that matters. That absolutely matters. In email communications, professionally, it matters because it also, you have to be able to communicate and you have to be able to communicate effectively. And if you are not paying attention to the way that you're speaking and the way you're coming across. I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you have to take a minute, reread what you wrote, put some care into it so that other people don't have to struggle so much to understand what it is that you're trying to say.
You've mentioned resume. A resume that's more than one page, fair or foul?
I think it's fair. I think it's not that big of a deal. If I got one that was 2 pages long, I wouldn't blink an eye. If it's 6 pages, wait. No, too much. Like, I don't care that you worked at Jimmy John's after high school. Like, don't care. You are 35 years old. Like, I do not need to know that. Like, I mean, believe me, like my family had sandwich shops growing up. So I worked in the sub shop all through high school and college, and I managed the shops in college. And, which is funny to me now, thinking as a manager, I was like, 20 or 21, but I did all that. And that gave me immeasurable amounts of life experience with people and understanding how to handle situations, whatever, all that stuff, just life experience. And it's important. It's important to my overall personality and the way I approach things and how I am with people and everything. But no one cares about that if I'm trying to get a job in a completely different field 15 years later. It just doesn't matter. It just has to come off at some point. At some point, it becomes an anecdote about you. And I also don't need to know every project you ever worked on at that particular job. Don't need to know. I mean, what are we going to talk about when you get hired at some or whatever? Like, there's got to be like, no one's going to remember that. All they do is read your resume and they go, oh, and they get the main points and they see that you understand what you are talking about. You understand what the job was. You can see that you did it well. You understood it. You're explaining it well. Like, that's enough. It doesn't have to be like, I got a certificate for attending a 1-hour course on this thing 10 years ago. I don't care. Anybody can do that. That's not a skill.
Yeah, so especially
I mean, I know I sound a little harsh and I can come across that way, but I mean it. I'm trying to help you.
If you were in the profession, in the early 2000s, there was so much training going on that you went to training.
Oh my God, I know.
Probably once a quarter easily. So you could easily fill up a whole page on just going to all the different week-long trainings.
Yeah, all the CMAP courses and all that stuff that everybody was taking. Yeah.
All right. If you being the editor is the first thing I think when I think of Sam Gwinn, the second thing is music. And I refer to you as a music enthusiast because I think it's just more than you being a music fan. Because just to listen to you talk about music, for those people that don't know you, just talk a little bit about music and how it's impacted you.
So I think enthusiast is the right word. I don't know how to play any instruments. I'm not a technical music junkie person type, whatever. Like, I'm like a lot of people. If I went to see a show it's full of really amazing musicianship and they're, improvising and doing all these cool things. Like, to me, it just sounds beautiful. It sounds like, it just sounds good, or it doesn't. Sometimes it's whatever, like some sorts of music a little too, like, what is the word, cacophonous? Is that a word? Yeah, that's a word. Yeah. but yeah, it just sounds good to me. I don't know that, like, oh, they changed key to whatever, like, I don't know I have no idea what notes they're playing or what's happening. I just like it. And biggest thing for me, I really like lyrics. I can turn on instrumentals, and I'd like to go to shows where people are just playing music and can kind of dance to it. And when I say dance, I mean like in the, jam band hippie style of dancing. That's generally the kind of dancing that I'm doing is, I'm slowly but surely becoming that old lady at the music festival who's like off dancing by herself. But yeah, I really am into listening to the words and lyrics mean a lot to me. And it occurred to me at some point that, I was like, oh, I don't understand poetry. I don't read poetry. And it was like, well, I guess I kind of do, because so many of my favorite musicians and songwriters really have helped me to see the world differently and to identify with different experiences that I wouldn't have had in my life. And that part is really important. And then just the feeling of being at a live show and that give and take with the artist that you have at a lot of live shows. And I don't even mean like big massively produced types of things. Like, I'm sure, like, I've never seen Lady Gaga, and I'm sure that is like an incredible show. Like, she's awesome. But like, I even mean one guy on stage with a guitar in a room with 20 people. You can still have that same, for me, it's just a level of how much they're putting into it and how much the audience is receiving it and giving back. I think that feeling is really good. If you can do it with your friends in the sunshine with a beer, even better. Like, that's an even better experience on top of that.
All right. So you mentioned music festivals. So here's what I want to do. I want to have just play a little game here, and I want you to describe what the Sam Gwinn Music Festival would look like. Talk about the venue, the lineup, how long it would be,
right.
Whatever you want to add to the story, just to give the listeners an idea of what your music festival would look like.
Oh, well, I can say that one of my favorite festivals, and I'll tell you why, is the High Water Festival that's in Charleston, South Carolina. It's been this would have been the 4th year, and it got canceled, unfortunately, because of the current situation. It was actually supposed to just be a couple weeks ago. It's just a 2-day festival, which honestly, as I get older, the 2-dayers are a little more manageable. I went to bunch of friends and I went to a 3-day festival last year. We went to Bourbon and Beyond in Louisville, which was great, but it was by day 3 we were like, I'm gonna die now. So the 2-day festival is a nice plan. The other thing I really like about this festival is it's just 2 stages. So there's 2 stages. They're within a reasonable amount of walking distance to each other, and there's no overlap. So you can easily catch a full set and then walk over to the other stage and see that next band. You might miss a little bit on the in between if you stop and get a drink or if you're walking slowly or whatever, but you can still hear it. And so you don't really miss anything, and they don't really spend a lot of in between time. Like, that I really like. And even the single stage festivals are really nice. Telluride Bluegrass Festival is another just absolutely incredible event that I've only been to twice. Really dying to get back there, but it's just one stage, and they do have some other events, like evening events and some other like random things going on throughout the town of Telluride. But there's one big stage. They limit the attendance to a manageable number of people so that you never feel like you're going to be overrun. It's another thing I really like is, like, even with Telluride, I think they top it at like 10,000 attendees, I want to say, and I think with High Water they keep it to a certain amount that it's manageable. You have your own space. You're never worried about like getting caught up in the crowd in the dark. Really, it's a comfortable, relaxing kind of environment. Those things are important. There's a lot of people that go to festivals and to music shows in general, and all my friends that are listening will know exactly what I'm about to say, is that when people are not paying attention to the music and they're just talking, it drives me out of my damn mind. And it's become like a thing where I sometimes can't help myself, and I have to be like, excuse me, could you please be quiet? And it almost never works out well, but I can't. And lately I'll just move. Like, I just be like, I gotta walk away from this area and go somewhere else where I can hear and I can enjoy this and not listen to like these 2 girls who haven't seen each other in a couple of years catching up about their general, like, I just can't do it. And there's a culture of people who go to concerts as a social event. And maybe people that are into more like DJ type stuff, I guess you could say, where it doesn't matter if you're not looking at the performer. It doesn't matter that you're not part of it in that kind of a setting, almost like a nightclub kind of setting. And then there's people that go to shows with the opposite frame of mind. And so when you get all those people together, and which often happens at a festival, you get that intermingling. So if I had like a rule, at my dream festival, it would be like, there would be certain talking zones. So, so as far as the lineup goes, there's actually a great lineup, almost a dream lineup this year at the Ohana Festival, which is scheduled for September. I think it's September in Dana Point, California. So this is a festival that Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, who is one of my favorite musicians and favorite people in the world, he puts this is his festival, right? So he puts it together. He works on the lineup and everything himself. This year, he's playing solo. Pearl Jam is playing, who is my all-time favorite band. They're playing, which they came back this year with a new album. It's incredible. I was actually supposed to have seen them twice this spring, but of course, we'll just have to wait. Yeah, but also My Morning Jacket is one of my favorite bands also, and they are headlining one. Actually, they're not headlining, but they're playing one night there as well. So they would most definitely be on my dream festival lineup. The other artists that I'm really into right now, I would say, and that's just I generally love to see it at festivals, are Flaming Lips are pretty great at festivals. Dr. Dog is one of my favorites. Shovels and Rope, and Shovels and Rope actually curates the High Water Festival that I mentioned in Charleston. So they're always fun to see. Lucas Nelson is one of my favorite musicians right now. That's actually Willie Nelson's son, who has his own band called Promise of the Real, and they're just unbelievable. Deer Tick is another favorite of mine. Fiona Apple came out with a new album this year. I would love to see her at a festival. Yeah. And I'll mention Glenn Hansard too. Glenn Hansard is an Irish musician who has been doing a couple of things like live stream kind of things lately, thankfully, but he's just utterly one of my favorite people. And when you talk about the give and take of a live performance, he really has perfected that, and all of his shows are just very intimate experiences.
Real answer there. I appreciate that. That was good detail there. So thank you. All right. So we have one last segment for the show. It's called Words to the World. I give the guest the last word so you can promote any idea or tell us what you're working on or whatever you want to talk about. This is your time. So just let us know what your words to the world are.
My words to the world would be focused a little bit on what's happening right now in the world with the stay-at-home orders. I think just to be kind and to not get caught up in everything that you see on the news, maybe even just turn off the news, turn off cable news. That's been a big, I don't think pet peeve is the right word. It's more of I think it's the gouge of civilization. Turn off cable news, go outside, be nice to people. Don't read the comments on anything on the internet at all. Just try to take this time to regroup a little bit. I read somewhere that this was considered to be the great pause is a good way to put it for everyone to just have to stay home and be alone with your thoughts for a minute. And it's probably easier for me to say since I do live alone and I don't have kids eating everything in the fridge and screaming and having to teach them their curriculum and all that. But I just feel like take the opportunity, learn some lessons from what's happening right now, come out of it with a new frame of mind that's maybe a little more open to others that aren't like you.
Very good. Well, Sam, I always tell people they have given me just enough to talk bad about them later, which you've done very well. It's a very good program. Thank you so much for taking the time with me today, and you take care of yourself.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you for joining us today on Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. We hope you not only enjoyed the show, but also learned something new. For more information on our guests and information relating to today's topic, please visit our website at leapodcast.com. Special thanks to the Rough and Tumble for our theme song. For more of their music, you can visit their website at theroughandtumble.com. Also thanks to Kyle McMullen for our show logo. For more of his design, please visit his website at moderntype.com. The show is hosted, recorded, and edited by Jason Elder and written by me, Mindy. You can contact us both via the LEA Podcast website. Please join us again next time as we interview another expert in this great field.